A sloth, a donkey, and a curious human. Send a prompt and see what they're doing. One hits record with a question on his mind. Two brothers pick it up, see what they find. Corn takes his time, Herman's got the facts. Back and forth, they never hold back. My weird prompts, come on in, that's where we begin. My weird prompts, glad you're here.
This episode was generated using artificial intelligence. Please verify facts.
My Weird Prompts is a community-driven initiative exploring how AI can fuel curiosity and uncover the fascinating ways our world works. GPU compute for this podcast is generously provided by Modal. Learn more at modal.com.
I was looking at some satellite imagery of the McMurdo Sound recently, and it really strikes you how Antarctica is this massive isolation paradox. We have never been more connected to it through high-speed satellite links and streaming video, yet it remains the most physically inaccessible place on the planet once that winter window slams shut. Today is March 15th, 2026, and for the people down there right now, the door is already closed. Today's prompt from Daniel is about the reality of living in Antarctica, specifically the mechanics of resupply, surviving the extreme cold, and what the community is actually like on those research stations.
It is a fascinating ecosystem, Corn. I am Herman Poppleberry, and I have been obsessed with the logistics of the High South for years because it is effectively the closest thing we have to a moon-based simulation. When we talk about how many people are there, it is not a static number. It is a massive seasonal swing. During the summer season, which runs roughly from October to February, you have about 4,800 people across the continent. But once March hits and the light starts to fail, that number drops precipitously to around 1,200 people for the winter over.
That is a huge drop. You're essentially evacuating 3/4 of the population before the ice locks everything down. Who are the 1,200 people left behind? I assume it is not just scientists staring at ice cores for 8 months straight.
Most people assume it is all PhDs, but the reality is that the vast majority of those 1,200 people are support staff. You need electricians, plumbers, cooks, and mechanics to keep the life support systems running. At McMurdo Station, which is the largest American base, the winter over population is usually around 191 people. If you look at the Amundsen-Scott South Pole Station, the numbers are even more exclusive. Since 1957, only 1,766 people have ever wintered over at the South Pole. That is a remarkably small club across 70 years of human history. To put that in perspective, more people have stood on the summit of Mount Everest in a single week than have spent a winter at the South Pole in the last 7 decades.
It really puts the exclusive in exclusive research. I want to dig into the logistics first, because the prompt mentioned the mechanics of resupply. I saw reports about Operation Deep Freeze 2025 recently, and it sounded like a total headache. The traditional ice pier failed again, right?
The ice pier is a constant battle against physics. For those who do not know, they traditionally freeze a massive block of ice, reinforce it with steel cable, and use it as a dock for the cargo ships. But the sea ice has been so unstable lately that the 331st Transportation Company had to pivot to a marine causeway system. This is a modular floating pier system that the Army uses for logistics over-the-shore operations. They had to assemble it in sub-zero conditions just to offload 380 pieces of critical cargo from the Ocean Giant and the Ocean Gladiator. We are talking about everything from heavy construction vehicles to mobile office units and delicate electronics.
It seems like a very fragile way to run a multi-billion-dollar research program. If that causeway fails, or if the ships cannot get through the ice during that tiny January window, the station is essentially dead in the water for the next year. It is not like you can just call a delivery service if you forget a crate of spare parts.
That is why the National Science Foundation is currently overseeing a massive infrastructure modernization. There is actually a new floating barge pier being built in Portland right now. The plan was to have it towed down and installed at Winter Quarters Bay by February 2026. They are trying to move away from these temporary high-stakes workarounds because the mission requirements are growing. We just finished the 2024 to 2025 field season for the Center for Oldest Ice Exploration, or COLDEX. They are drilling for ice cores that could be 1.5 million years old. You cannot do that kind of precision science if you are worried about whether your fuel shipment is going to sink into the sound.
The fuel aspect is what gets me. You are not just resupplying food and lab equipment. You are shipping in the very energy required to keep people from freezing to death in a place where the mean winter temperature at the South Pole is minus 51 degrees Celsius. I have seen the record lows are down around minus 85. How do you engineer a building to survive that without the foundations cracking or the pipes shattering?
The South Pole Station is a marvel of engineering because it is actually on stilts. It is designed with an aerodynamic shape so the wind blows underneath it, which prevents snow from drifting and burying the station. As the snow level eventually rises over decades, they can actually jack the entire building up to keep it clear. But inside that shell, you are dealing with a closed-loop system. Every drop of water is melted from the ice cap using waste heat from the generators. They use something called a Rodriguez well, or a rod well. They circulate hot water into the ice to create a massive underground bulb of liquid water, then pump it up. If the power goes out, you have a very short window before the entire facility becomes an unrecoverable block of ice.
It reminds me of our discussion in episode 9089 about polar logistics. Everything is a trade-off. But let's talk about the people for a second. Daniel asked about what it is like to live there for a protracted period. Once the last plane leaves in March, you are stuck. There is no rescue, no supply drops, and no, I changed my mind. I want to go home. What does that do to the human psyche?
There is a documented cluster of effects known as winter over syndrome. It includes things like depression, irritability, and insomnia. But the most interesting part is what researchers call psychological hibernation. It is a form of adaptive numbness. People enter a state of emotional flatness where they just sort of drift through the months. It is not quite clinical depression. It is more like the brain slowing down its emotional processing to cope with the extreme monotony and the lack of sensory input. You are seeing the same 190 people every day eating the same frozen or canned food in the same 3 buildings for 8 months.
I imagine the lack of privacy factor is the hardest part. I read that 60% of leisure time is spent alone in the dorm room just because it is the only place you can escape the community. But then you have these weird communal traditions, like the manual bowling alley at McMurdo.
The bowling alley is legendary. It is one of the last ones in the world where the pins have to be set by hand. It is this strange, low-tech relic in the middle of a high-tech research station. You also have bars, a gym, and an indoor basketball court. These are not luxuries, they are essential psychological infrastructure. The biggest event of the year is midwinter on June 21st. It is the shortest day of the year, the absolute deepest point of the dark, and every station from every nation celebrates it. They exchange greetings via radio and internet. They have massive formal dinners, and they often watch the movie The Thing as a sort of dark rite of passage. It is this shared holiday that crosses all geopolitical lines.
It is interesting that even in a place governed by the Antarctic Treaty of 1959, which bans military activity and territorial claims, you still have these distinct national flavors. But the American presence, specifically through the military support of Operation Deep Freeze, is what really provides the backbone for the science. I think people often forget that without the Navy Cargo Handling Battalion 1 and the Military Sealift Command, the National Science Foundation would just be a bunch of guys in parkas standing on a very cold beach.
The logistics are the mission. If the logistics fail, the science stops. But the nature of that science is changing. Connectivity has fundamentally altered the winter over experience. In the 1970s, you were lucky to get a patchy radio connection to talk to your family. Now, staff at McMurdo can stream video and watch live sports. While that sounds great, some of the older ice people argue it has ruined the community. Instead of everyone hanging out in the galley or the bar, people are retreating to their rooms to watch Netflix. It has traded communal resilience for individual comfort.
That is a classic modern trade-off, isn't it? We see the same thing in the real world. But in Antarctica, that communal resilience might actually be a safety requirement. If there is an emergency and everyone is siloed in their digital bubbles, do you lose that muscle memory of working as a tight-knit crew?
NASA actually uses these winter-over crews as an analog for long-duration space missions, like a trip to Mars. They study the crew dynamics specifically to see how isolation affects teamwork. One of the takeaways is that the human element is almost always the primary failure point. You can have the most advanced life support systems in the world, but if the crew stops communicating or if psychological hibernation turns into active resentment, the mission is in jeopardy. They even track things like T3 syndrome, which is a drop in thyroid hormones that can lead to memory loss and cognitive decline in polar environments.
I want to go back to the adaptive numbness you mentioned. Is that a choice, or is it a biological response to the environment? Because if you are living in minus 50 degrees with no sun for months, your circadian rhythms must be completely shattered.
It is a bit of both. The lack of a light-dark cycle wreaks havoc on your melatonin and cortisol levels. Your body doesn't know when to be alert and when to sleep. Most people end up with big eye, which is the local term for the chronic insomnia that hits during the winter. You are tired all the time, but you cannot sleep because the environmental cues are gone. The numbness is a way for the brain to protect itself from the stress of that constant physiological disarray. It is a survival mechanism that keeps you from exploding at your roommate, because they chewed their toast too loudly for the fourth month in a row.
It made me think about the resilience we discussed back in episode 878. Humans are incredibly good at surviving in places we have no business being. But it seems like the science of Antarctica is increasingly about the logistics of just staying alive. When you look at the COLDEX project, how much of their time is spent actually looking at ice versus just making sure the drill doesn't freeze to the floor?
It is probably an 80-20 split in favor of maintenance. In those conditions, everything becomes brittle. Plastics snap, oils turn to jelly, and metal can become as fragile as glass. Every mechanical action requires 5 times the effort it would take in a temperate climate. The COLDEX teams are out there in the deep field, living in tents or mobile office units, trying to maintain high-precision instruments in a place that is actively trying to destroy them. They are looking for ice that was formed when the Earth's climate transition was happening over 1 million years ago. It is a testament to the engineering that they get any data at all.
And yet, people keep going back. There is a high rate of repeat offenders in the Antarctic program. People who go down for one season and end up spending 10 years of their lives there. What is the draw? Is it the exclusivity of being one of the few people at the South Pole? Or is it the simplicity of a life where your only goal is survival and science?
For a lot of people, it is the escape from the complexity of modern life. In Antarctica, the rules are very clear. You follow the safety protocols, you do your job, and the community takes care of the rest. There are no taxes to file, no traffic to sit in, and no constant barrage of consumerist noise. It is a very pure existence, even if it is a very cold one. Plus, there is a certain prestige to it. Only 1,766 people in history have wintered at the pole. That is fewer people than have climbed Mount Everest in the last few years alone.
I think there is also a geopolitical angle we should acknowledge. While the Antarctic Treaty keeps things peaceful, having a year-round presence like McMurdo or the South Pole Station is a massive statement of national capability. It shows that the United States has the logistical reach to maintain a permanent, high-tech footprint at the end of the Earth. In a world where the Arctic is becoming more militarized, which we touched on in episode 829, keeping the Antarctic as a stable, science-led environment is a huge diplomatic win.
It is the ultimate soft power. We are not there with tanks, we are there with ice drills and marine causeway systems. But that infrastructure is double-edged. As it gets normalized and we bring in the floating barge piers and the high-speed internet, does it stop being a frontier? If you can watch the Super Bowl live at the South Pole, are you really in the wilderness anymore?
I think the environment will always ensure it is a frontier. You can have all the bandwidth in the world, but if the heater fails when it is minus 80 outside, the internet isn't going to save you. The physical reality of Antarctica is the ultimate arbiter. I am curious about the community aspect Daniel asked about. Is there a hierarchy between the scientists and the beakers, as I've heard the support staff called?
Usually the term beaker is what the support staff calls the scientists. There is often a bit of healthy tension there. The technicians and tradespeople are the ones who actually keep the station running, and they sometimes feel like the scientists are guests in their house. But during the winter over, those barriers tend to dissolve. When you are one of only 191 people, you have to get along. You might be a world-class astrophysicist, but if the plumber doesn't like you, your life is going to be very uncomfortable.
It is the ultimate equalizer. I love the idea of a manual bowling alley being the social hub for people who are literally exploring the origins of the universe. It is such a human detail. Let's talk about the takeaways here. If someone is listening to this and thinking, I want to go to Antarctica, or if they are just interested in the logistical lessons, what is the big picture?
The first takeaway is that Antarctica is a masterclass in constrained resource management. Everything you use has to be planned for a year in advance. If you run out of a specific type of bolt in June, you are not getting another one until January. That level of foresight is something we rarely have to exercise in the modern world. It forces a type of discipline that is actually very healthy for engineering and project management. In a corporate environment, we call it just-in-time logistics, but in Antarctica, it is just-in-case logistics.
It also highlights the fragility of our global supply chains. We take it for granted that we can get anything delivered in 48 hours. Antarctica is the one place where that rule doesn't apply. It makes you realize how much buffer we usually have, and how quickly things get real when that buffer is removed.
My second takeaway would be the importance of the human element in extreme environments. We often focus on the tech, the ice piers, the nuclear-powered carriers like we discussed in episode 999, the fancy dorms. But the primary failure point is almost always psychological. If you are designing for extreme environments, whether it is an oil rig, a space station, or a remote research outpost, you have to design for the human brain's need for social connection and sensory variety. You cannot just give people a tablet and a bunk and expect them to remain functional.
And finally, the fact that only 1,766 people have wintered at the South Pole should remind us how hostile that environment really is. We have conquered it in a sense, but only because we spend billions of dollars on a constant, frantic resupply effort. We aren't living there, we're just camping very expensively.
It is a permanent state of emergency management disguised as a research program. But what a program it is! To be able to pull a core of ice out of the ground that contains a record of the atmosphere from 1,000,000 years ago is worth every modular causeway and every frozen gallon of fuel. It is the only place on Earth where we can look back that far into our own history.
I think it is a great place to wrap this up. We have looked at the mechanics of the resupply, the brutal reality of the cold, and the strange, numb but resilient community that keeps the whole thing spinning. It is a world of manual bowling alleys and high-speed satellites, all held together by a few hundred people who are willing to spend 8 months in the dark.
It is a wild world down there. Thanks for the prompt, Daniel. It is always good to dive into the logistics of the impossible.
Thanks as always to our producer, Hilbert Flumingtop, for keeping the show on the rails. And a big thanks to Modal for providing the GPU credits that power this show. This has been My Weird Prompts. If you are enjoying our deep dives into the fringes of human experience, find us at myweirdprompts.com for our full archive and all the ways to subscribe.
Stay warm out there.
See you next time.
This episode was generated using Gemini Flash 3. Text-to-speech engine was Chatterbox.
Thanks for listening to our show, my